Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Today's session will cover the surge in cyber attacks against the financial system caused by COVID-19 or enhanced by COVID-19. And we have three seasoned experts leading the presentation that will bring both technical and legal insights from recent cases and clients they've helped. Before we get started, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. We are using GoToWebinar for this presentation, and you will find the GoToWebinar client floating somewhere on your monitor. Through that client, you'll be able to submit questions at any time, and we will have time at the end of the presentation to address those questions. So as you hear any comments or you want to make any comments, please type it in the chat. We'll have a Q&A session at the end with the presenters. Please do keep in mind that today's presentation was carefully researched, but do not represent any official positions from Duff & Phelps, VMware, or Norton Rose Fulbright. And let me introduce you the speakers real quick. We have Keith Wojcicki from Kroll, Tom Kellerman from VMware Carbon Black, and Will Daugherty from Norton Rose Fulbright. Keith is Managing Director in Kroll's Cyber Risk Practice. He leads our threat intelligence program and comes to Kroll from the United States Secret Service, where he helped fight transnational crime. Tom Kellerman is the head of cybersecurity strategy for VMware Carbon Black. He's a former deputy CISO for the World Bank Treasury and commissioner on the Commission on Cybersecurity for President Obama. Tom recently presented on this topic to the Committee on Financial Services, Subcommittee on National Security in the United States Congress, and a lot of the presentation today is based on that discussion. And Will Daugherty is a nationally recognized leader in data protection and privacy and is a partner in the Norton Rose Fulbright Data Protection, Privacy, and Cybersecurity Group. Clients in a broad range of industries, especially financial institutions, turn to Will for his experience, practical solutions, and thought leadership on managing risks with data and technology. Now, this, of course, was just a brief introduction. I'm going to turn to Keith now so we can get us started, but you'll learn a lot more about these presenters as we go through. Keith, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Leo. I really do appreciate it. And good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar. As Leo said, my name is Keith Wojcicki. I'm a managing director with Kroll, and we have a really exciting panel today with some of the top leading experts in cyber. Kind of going through today the agenda, we're looking at some key takeaways from this webinar, and it's really going to be focused on the financial sector and the financial sector attacks and dealing with cyber. We'll start with looking at current threat vectors and cyber threat landscapes. We'll talk about destructive attacks and how they can counter incident response. Then we'll talk about a little bit about island hopping and how it can assist in obfuscating the attacker's actions. It's really, really intriguing how they do this and making really investigations for IR teams more challenging and doing what we're trying to do for the end goal. The new attack vectors are really developing daily, and we'll touch a little bit on access mining and how it's on the rise. Finally, we'll review some of the investigative techniques and why it's so important to have a data privacy counsel throughout the entire process and what that involves. You can go ahead, Leo, next slide. So as we're looking at current threats we're facing today, Kroll collects data from all the incidents we engage. We work approximately, I'd say about 2,000 engagements a year. And as we collect this information, we review, we pull the data, we analyze it, and looking at the financial services sector itself, we've identified over 56% of the engagements has some type of nexus to that financial service, with email compromise, which is the most observed threat incident that we see. As you can see, it's almost double, more than double, almost 3 times from the next one that we're intaking. Now, I'm sure that this is not a surprise to many, but not only is it the highest in financial sector, but really the most observed attack vector in all of Kroll cases in 2019 and continues in 2020. So as we look at the next slide here, you're going to actually see something that's really relevant. I mean, you're looking at this, they're very good. The attackers today are so sophisticated by looking at different areas that they want to compromise their credentials. This is just a small example By hovering over a little link, you can see that it takes you to a malicious access. So as we're going on the threat landscape and we're looking at all these sorts of attacks, we've seen different methods with the onset of COVID-19. It really kind of gave us a different purview into it and how the attacks are happening. Tom, I kind of want to go to you and see what attacks are you guys seeing and what are extremely successful in obtaining the goal of actually compromising these networks.
Yeah, in the last 3 months, we've seen an increase of custom malware, operating system attacks, primarily because people are working from home. Much more reconnaissance is being conducted on senior leadership teams and who their executive assistants are. And they're leveraging unique vectors from island hopping to watering hole attacks, as well as smishing. But I've seen a dramatic uptick of custom malware and operating system attacks, as well as attacks on applications themselves or the APIs associated with fintech.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting talking about APIs, because APIs are known, especially in the financial area, that are really, high level. That's where they're attacking from, is attacking these APIs. The different groups that are attacking them. It's very interesting that you brought that to the attention here. Now, Will, with the attacks occurring on this upward path, all victims want to be able to take action as quickly as possible. When a victim company has really detected an attack and kind of following the NIST framework, they respond to it immediately. What challenges are they facing? What legal concerns are really imperative that you need to address when this attack is identified?
Sure. From a legal perspective, and frankly, from a effective response perspective, we really need to address 3 critical questions early on. What systems and data may have been accessed or acquired? Has the incident caused operational disruption that may materially impair the financial institution's ability to provide services to its customers? Or will the remediation efforts necessary cause a similar disruption? And 3, what steps does the organization need to protect its customers, employees, and to comply with its regulatory notification requirements? And really one of the most critical steps in answering those questions is getting sufficient visibility into the organization's environment very quickly to understand which systems and data are potentially involved, how the attackers got into the environment, how the actors may have expanded their foothold so that an effective containment plan can be built in parallel to investigating what the actors may have accessed or acquired. And so it's really critical, I think, for if the financial institution, even if they do have an EDR solution, endpoint detection response solution in place, that they have an outside forensics firm that they can work with who can quickly collect available forensic evidence and get that visibility in the environment. Because a lot of times what we see happen is organizations start taking immediate sort of containment steps that without actually understanding where the actors have expanded their foothold and fully understand what needs to take place to effectively kick the actors outside of the environment. And so, and there's certain regulatory requirements that also need to be understood in advance. So that's the other sort of parallel discussion I'm having with the general counsel about the financial institution, so that we can understand, given the questions that we need answered, what are going to be the regulatory requirements for notification? From a territorial scope, are they U.S. or are they international? Are we looking at GDPR applicability, which requires notification within 72 hours to a data protection authority? Similarly, in U.S. federal regulators, they have requirements as well if there's going to be an impact on non-public personal information of customers. And so we want to understand what that regulatory landscape looks like so that we understand what triggers are at play for notifying those regulators. And even if there's not a regulatory requirement, it's also really important to understand what their ongoing relationships are with their bank examiners, for example, because even though you might not have an obligation to notify your examiners or the regulatory authorities that have oversight over your organization, from a practical perspective, it goes a long way oftentimes to informally reach out early on to give them a heads up rather than wait several weeks before you're able to answer some of the critical questions. And that really helps you down the line in building trust. So those are the main areas that I'm focusing on in the early days of a security incident.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So a lot of these challenges that we see, at least in the investigative realm, that we see that information is out there, whether it's notified, it's on the dark web because it's being sold, or you know something has been taken, you see some type of evidence, but you can't really identify what that evidence is. Does that really provide a challenging area for you in order to say, hey, okay, we need to notify X, Y, and Z, but not knowing exactly what they touch? How does your approach adjust, during that time frame when you're looking at all the evidence, even on the early stages, and the clock starts ticking? How do you differentiate between, okay, this is something that we need to notify, or this is something maybe not need to, but we need to find more information about this? Is there a strategy you approach on that?
Yeah, generally I say let the forensics drive the communications, because really we need answers to 4 questions. What happened? How did it happen? What are we doing to protect the individuals that were affected? And what steps are we taking to prevent this from happening again? All those questions are generally driven by the forensics. And when you're in a situation where you know that there's been unauthorized access or even exfiltration of some data, I caution clients to go immediately public with that, because oftentimes we may not know the full scope of other information that could be involved. And if you look back at some incidents such as Target, where they go out very early on an investigation and say the information that was involved is limited to X, Y, and Z. We're only 2 weeks in the investigation. PIN numbers were not affected, but then they have to come back a week later after the forensics progresses, and they say, wait a second, more data, 40 million customers' usernames and passwords were affected, PINs were affected. The organization loses confidence from its customers, from the regulators, and it's going to invite scrutiny. So I really want to be able to have good, high confidence in the forensics findings around the scope of the data that's involved before we actually start communicating to the public about that. And to the extent that that is going to take some time, we generally have a parallel path of going ahead and starting to prepare those communications if we know that some data set is potentially accessed, so that whenever the investigation has given us the answers of the scope of the incident, we're ready to go very quickly with those communications. But the reality is, to your point, oftentimes forensics aren't able to specifically tell us what was and was not accessed. And unfortunately, the way that these data protection laws are structured and the way that the regulators interpret them, they're in consumer protection statutes. So regulators expect that you err on the side of caution. And so the way I guide clients through this issue is, unless we can show through our investigation that it's reasonable to conclude that there was, even though there was access into the environment, we have found forensics to confirm that there wasn't unauthorized access or acquisition to certain data. And we need strong forensics to be able to back that up, and forensic evidence.
Yeah, yeah, you're absolutely right. So almost like the old saying, patience is a virtue. Take into account everything that's going on, utilize that time to actually collect everything, and then, do the notifications as necessary. And that kind of leads us into the next topic here with the kind of like destructive attacks. And there's 2 areas of thought on destructive attacks. So I know, Tom, you've had some really good reporting on that, especially with Carbon Black, had a very good detailed report on these types of attacks and discussed the statistics around these attacks. Now, being involved in this response, each of us has seen attacks daily, but what do you think, Tom, is the most the most key takeaways from these destructive attacks?
So in the Modern Bank Heist report, which VMware Carbon Black produces every year, we noted that we've seen a dramatic uptick of destructive attacks. These are wipers being deployed into systems, or ransomware being employed into systems, not Petya style, where they're not actually asking for ransom, and the destruction of entire subnets. Now, this is not, there's no reporting requirement behind destructive attacks. You don't need to report necessarily, and correct me if I'm wrong, Will, if something was destroyed, only if it was stolen and it wasn't encrypted. So that being said, there's this gap. There's a situational awareness gap. You're seeing this transition from a bank heist to a hostage situation. There's a dramatic escalation. And I'm not sure personally whether it's due to ramped up geopolitical tension or whether it's due to counter-incident response, because 1 out of 4 defenders when reacting to an intrusion is experiencing counter-incident response, which involves everything from deleting logs to playing with timestamps. Keith, you've seen that a lot. And then finally, they're just dropping literally logic bombs in systems to either punish the defender or to burn the evidence.
Yeah, you brought up some really good points, and you're talking about these destructive attacks, and and the counterintelligence. It's something we talked about earlier, but I never really gave it much thought. But we had a current case in the Maze ransomware group. In the Maze group, now these guys are extremely sophisticated. They're starting to work in a cartel-like manner with other groups to kind of share malware, share ransomware, share information, ideas, and even their Maze news site. So you're seeing all this collaboration between the criminals, which is dangerous in a sense. And one of the things we identified was the Maze group got in there. They adjusted these logs and the timestamps to show that, okay, this was infected a year earlier than the attack actually occurred. So it's throwing off this incident response when you're looking at all this time and effort going into a year before when it was only maybe a couple months prior. So you're absolutely right. It's really interesting how this works. And in doing so, they're able to post all this stuff. I think right now we counted maybe 12 shaming sites that we have, Maze being the top, that post every 24 hours or so. This large group of new victims. Now, in dealing with that and seeing that, Will, how do you guys deal with that when you say you have all of these victims possibly posting these shaming sites? You're dealing with possible exfiltration, notification. I mean, there's just so much going on there. How do you coordinate that and still address, should we pay this, and should we, we have this information, whether it's however many gigabytes, we've seen up to terabytes of data that are on these shaming sites. What's kind of going through your mind and your recommendations towards these individuals?
Yeah, when you've got both ransomware and evidence of exfiltration and extortion, you really have to take a multifaceted approach. You still need to address the operational impact, right, and assess whether or not your backups are going to allow you to restore those systems without a loss of data that's going to impact your business. So you need to run through that contemporaneously, and that's going to impact whether or not you need to actually start negotiating with the attackers to obtain the decryption key. Some ransomware attackers who also extort will provide separate ransoms, one for the decryption key, one for the extortion. Others treat it as a sort of a package that, look, you need to pay for the decryption key, or we're going to release this data and post it on this website. So to the extent that they have indicated and have shown some evidence, and I have a client that recently did have an attack group after the ransomware was kicked off, post to their Twitter account a portion of a screenshot of a sample of what they have taken. And so really from there, we need to certainly start preparing reactive holding statements because of the public awareness, and so that the organization has approved communications to address any sort of media or customer questions about that. So that's something you need to get on very early. Then you also need to start understanding what is the scope of the data that they may have. And it's a combination of forensics and also based upon what screenshots they share. Can we get enough information from what they've identified to understand where that data resides, so that we can really start to hone in on the systems where we think the actors may have exfiltrated the data.
Will, I had a question for you. Specific to the use of existing regulation to punish victims like GDPR or California's privacy law, where do the regulators stand on that? I mean, your information has been expressly exfiltrated and posted. It wasn't negligence on the part of the organization, unless obviously they didn't have the security controls in place to stop that type of attack. But where do the regulators stand on that?
Well, a couple of important points. Number one, under GDPR, you have an obligation to notify in certain circumstances, not only if even if there's not unauthorized access, if the data becomes unavailable and you're unable to provide the services to the data subjects that you maintain the data for. So you do have a potential notification obligation if there hasn't been unauthorized access, but they're merely encrypted and you're unable to provide your services to the data subjects. And similarly, a obligation can arise under the New York Department of Financial Services and other financial institution regulations where the ransomware encryption actually causes a material impairment of your operations. So that's really important to know, to understand at the outset whether the systems that are encrypted are materially impairing, or whether you can rely on other business continuity plans that will allow you continue to provide those services in a different manner to avoid having to provide that early notification. But from a regulator standpoint, when data like that is exfiltrated, they really do not care really whether it was or was not the organization's fault initially. Initially, they want to make sure that they understand the number of individuals whose information was involved, the risk that information having been exfiltrated poses to those individuals, and what you're planning to do to help mitigate that potential risk to those customers. And certainly, though, once they get that information, to your point, the very next area they go is, well, what sort of security policies and procedures did you have in place? And for financial institutions, they're going to be looking at the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act and the applicable regulations that are to that organization. And that's exactly what they go for, is they want to see what sort of written information security policies and procedures you had in place. For ransomware incidents, they're really focused right now on business continuity planning and whether you had good backups that you had tested, and really whether you had adequate procedures in place. Regulators do recognize that even the most sophisticated and mature security programs can't block 100% attacks, but they still want to investigate to see whether or not weaknesses in those policies and procedures were really what caused this incident.
Yeah, that's interesting, and we've dealt with a couple of ransomware cases where they've had a very high level of maturity, and they some way somehow they got into the network. It's more of these guys wanted to. They encrypted everything, and they limited it to so much. And what they ended up doing was actually what they call shredding or destroying these files, so they can't even get them back. And then they attack their backups. Now, having been in law enforcement prior to this, I really had the opportunity to arrest some of these guys, these large level criminals that would do some of this stuff. And the first thing everyone told me is the first thing we do is to go when we get the backups. We go for the backups. That's what we're attacking first, because what are you doing when something happens? I mean, if it's online, if you can move laterally from your main network to your backup, why wouldn't you? They're doing that reconnaissance, Tom, like you said, and really trying to find out what's going on within the environment.
That's a great point, because many times organizations are slow to update the software associated with the backups, and they're exploiting obviously operational gaps and OS vulnerabilities in those backups, particularly the more elegant, sophisticated groups like Maze, like you described there.
Exactly. You're 100% correct. Now, it kind of leads us into the next topic here with island hopping. Now, this is so interesting, because you're seeing this with these different type of MSPs trying to help. We don't have the funds, we don't have the resources to really go in and do what we need to do to secure. So we're counting on these partners, these vendors, in order to help secure our data. And what's happening? I mean, the attackers are understanding this, and they're going in and they're launching their attacks from here, and then going out and really trying to affecting everyone in general. Tom, you're really familiar with this. Can you kind of give us a background of what your purview is, what you're seeing, and how this is transforming into a really dangerous area?
I think the hacker community has now appreciated that they can commandeer your digital transformation efforts and use your brand, your network, your website, your applications, your users to attack your constituency. Even the Secret Service put out a warning 2 weeks ago vis-a-vis MSPs being targeted heavily by organized hacker crews from Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. We need to appreciate that. We need to appreciate worst case scenario has changed. It's not a question of whether your house is going to get burglarized anymore. It's a question of whether or not you're going to deal with a hostage situation while you're having a dinner party, frankly. And that's what they choose to do. They want to colonize the infrastructure. They're not limited to merely just taking over that system and conducting wire transfer fraud. They appreciate the trust and confidence between different financial institutions or between fintech vendors and financial institutions, and they want to continue to grow their footprint. So this really takes form in 3 different ways. If you go to the next slide, you'll see it's not just network-based island hopping anymore. They're also leveraging watering hole attacks through your website, so your legitimate good website is now polluted. In addition, your mobile apps have the same vulnerabilities typically that a website does. So if you're not actually regularly testing for the OWASP vulnerabilities on those apps, and those apps themselves can turn against your customer base. And then there's reverse business email compromise, which is actually a technique pioneered by APT29, which is a Russian hardcore cyber militia / spy / criminal group. Don't get me started on that one. But the point is, they did something really elegant, which is they commandeer your mail server. And frankly, you don't know it's commandeered because it's, there's a DLP on it. It's encrypted. It's not pushing out spam. It's inside your perimeter. Everything's gravy. And then they start pushing out fireless malware just against your board of directors or against your largest partners with email communications that look very similar to recent communications because they use narrow-based machine learning, basically scrape the last 3 sentences that Keith sent to me. Maybe those sentences will be reused. I'm like, hey, this is Keith, and there's no attachment, so everything's good. But yeah, no, it's quite interesting. It's quite interesting how they're doing this. And again, it speaks to the fact that we're literally fighting a counterinsurgency in cyberspace right now. And that's why I'm proud to partner with Duff & Phelps and Kroll, because VMware Carbon Black, we don't provide specialized services. We know full well that prevention is impossible. You can't be 100% correct all the time, but detection and response is an imperative.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, talking about the reverse business email compromise and just the intelligence of these guys and the sophistication. I don't think people don't give them enough credit, but they don't understand how this is a profession. This is just like you or me or Will. We're all doing this, and this is kind of what we're experts in. And that's exactly what these guys are. We call it malware. They call it software. I mean, that's just what they do. It's just kind of funny. I'm going to pause here because I know we have a couple questions. Leo, is there a couple questions that we can answer right here in the middle of the webinar?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question was around the destructive attacks. Walter is asking, after the destruction, how can one demonstrate there wasn't data exfiltration? And given that challenge, do we still have to report or notify, I guess?
Do you want to start off with the forensic side of it?
Yeah,
some of the challenges when data and evidence is destroyed.
Yeah, well, that's just it, because it's funny because you're going to have these gaps in forensics, and it's evident when you're dealing with a high-level attacker, they're going to have gaps, and sometimes, and not only that, sometimes you don't have the logs. Sometimes you're just not capturing the data. For example, the Citrix environment is overwritten at a period of time, and if you don't identify that quickly enough, you're not going to have that information that shows that something was happening in your Citrix system. So, how do you address that? There's, and we'll let you talk about this, but there's other avenues, I think. There's way to identify and doing the best you possibly can to try to identify something was, exfiltrated. Whether it's through firewall activity, if you can see any type of evidence in any log analysis, if you're seeing stuff on the dark web, I mean, it's very difficult to do, to look on the dark web, but it is an option. But there are other things forensically you can take a look at with the logs. But the biggest concern that we have is that gap, and do we have something that mitigates that gap? So going forward, we always tell people, listen, you need to make sure you have logs 60 to 90 days on-prem, and then if they're somewhere off-site, keep them up to a year, if that's even a possibility, because keeping those logs and realizing what's going on when and if you do get attacked, you have that information you can go back on. But
you have to keep unfiltered data, though, on that endpoint for an extended period of time, just to digest the behavioral anomalies. And I will say one thing here: lateral movement is changing dramatically. They're not just relying on PowerShell anymore. That's kind of passé for them. The WMI and AMSI and process hollowing are the name of the game now. If you have no visibility into those things and the misuse of those things, you're flying blind.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Well, I'll throw it over to you for kind of, okay, now what do we do?
Yeah. So, I'd say at the time period before the last 6 months, 7 months, traditionally when we had a Ryuk ransomware attack or other type of ransomware attack, data theft was typically not part of what their motives were. And what we would do primarily in those circumstances is they still get unauthorized access into your network. And it still necessitates a very detailed investigation to know what they did in your investigation. In an ideal situation where it is a widespread type of a ransomware incident and you do have a lot of destruction of forensic evidence, we still really want to try to piece together how the actors, where they first got into the environment, where they moved laterally, and how they deployed the ransomware. Did they use GPO policies? Did they use a domain controller or others, a patch management server to programmatically deploy that ransomware? Ultimately, not actually physically behind the keyboard on a lot of those systems that maintain the sensitive data. And if we got sufficient forensic evidence to show that, this is how the attackers remotely and programmatically deployed the ransomware, they didn't actually get on some of these key systems that have sensitive data that would trigger notification obligations. We combine that with the intel that we have from the forensics team. We may even bring in law enforcement to get their input on what they've learned in their investigations, whether this attack group is known for data exfiltration. And if we combine that intelligence with the forensic evidence, we may be able to reach a conclusion that would support that while there was data that was encrypted, we have high confidence that there wasn't any evidence of exfiltration. But a lot of times that's not very easy to do in these scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's all about the method too. I mean, if they're using whatever whatever type of attack method you use, like you said, the GPO or the PS exec, and they release that information, it's tough. It is tough when you don't have the evidence and you have these gaps. So.
Yeah, I mean, just to give you an example. Now I'm investigating an incident where we know the actors, because this last 7 months have changed so much, they have extorted the client. We know they've got at least some documents that they've exfiltrated, but the reality is we don't have object access logging enabled to know what the actors accessed on each of these file share servers. And unless we're able to get to a point where the investigation where we can truly get that level of fidelity of findings, the client may be in a position of having to assume the worst, and no one likes that.
Right. Yeah. And Will, the person that posed the question, Walter, clarified that he's concerned that you can't not report when there's a destructive attack and you don't have the log. So I guess that's the worst case scenario you just referenced, right?
Yeah, I mean, for financial institutions, you also need to think about what your SARS reporting obligations are to FinCEN. They've given guidance on ransomware attacks, and even though you don't have an actual evidence that there's been a financial loss that meet the thresholds, you still may have a reporting obligation under SARS, and your regulators are expecting that if systems that are critical to the performance of your services, your financial services, that you do report those. So even if you don't have evidence of exfiltration, we really closely analyze when's the right time to notify these regulators. And in most organizations that have very close relationships with these financial regulators often err on the side of caution here and provide that heads up, but let them know that this is an ongoing investigation and that we'll provide further updates. And the regulators understand that these investigations take time, but they will ask for follow-up information. So you need to be cognizant of that, the need to keep them updated and to be prepared to answer the questions that they're going to have, and work closely with your forensics team to help prepare you to answer those questions.
And from a governance perspective, since many of you are general counsels, it's high time that you elevate the Chief Information Security Officer to be equal to the CIO with corresponding authorities and budgets. You will demonstrate just by doing that you have a proactive footing. At a minimum, you've got a defensive mindset at the top.
Completely agree.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Very good point. Leo, are there any other questions?
There's one more question thus far. It's around collaboration. Jim mentioned that forensics and investigative teams are performing one function. There's a piece that's, of course, taken by the internal audit team to self-identify and help with remediation. But tying all those pieces together, he's asking your thoughts on how to better the collaboration on those parts and help learn from the attack.
So come from incident response, the collaboration is key. I mean, by the time you detect an incident and then respond to it, the shorter that time frame is, the better it's going to be. And if you have all of these incident response plans in place, you test them. It's not even written on paper. Sure, maybe some companies don't even have it written on paper, but if you have it written on paper and you have everyone involved, they all know their roles, and then you test that, that's going to help that collaboration to find out who's doing what, how are we going forward, and what do we need to do to rectify this. Now, Will, I know you probably do this all the time with different firms and different clients, but just trying to understand the incident response plan from your angle. I mean, I know it helps us because we know who to call and we know who the point of contact is, and then they have that trust, the MSA in place that we're ready to rock and roll. The paperwork isn't delaying anything. It's just, okay, this is what's happening. Now let's move forward, and everyone kind of works together in this instance.
Yeah.
Kind of want to know what your thoughts are.
Oh, exactly. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of having a mature incident response plan, an incident response team that not only has I think a document is important for regulatory purposes for financial institutions, but it's equally important to have tested that through tabletop exercises and making sure that you've got backups, because inevitably these incidents happen when people are on vacation, some of the core people, and you want to make sure you're seamless in all circumstances. And then not only that, in terms of the specific question of the coordination of it, what I always recommend early on in an investigation is to designate somebody within the organization as the project lead. That's not the CISO, that's not the general counsel, but somebody that can really knows the organization well, has good project management experience, and can track all the different work streams that are going to be ongoing and overlapping, and make sure that everyone is accomplishing their task in a timely fashion, because the work streams do get complex when you've got communications work stream, you've got business continuity work stream, you've got investigation and preservation, you've got reporting obligations. There's a lot of work streams, and project management is really critical to that.
Tom, and I'm going to kind of go to you, because I think of all three of us, you probably have had the most difficult challenges when it comes to collaboration. Working in the government, working with the Obama administration, and working in different areas. You probably really had some challenging events. How did you mitigate that and really make sure everyone was on and working towards the same goal? Because I see it from my angle and being in the government, what I saw. But did you have a methodology or a strategic approach to that?
You know what? The Electronic Crimes Task Force of the Secret Service allowed me access to a myriad of different security personas in my region, within my industry, that allowed me purview into recent events, and particularly most importantly, it increased my situational awareness and ground truth. To that point, ground truth is an imperative in today's day and age, and that has to be contextual. Look at this thing, access mining marketplaces. I mean, that's basically, you've got an economy of scale in the dark web that the World Economic Forum says is going to be the third largest economy in the world by next year, because you have Russian-speaking dark forums that are allowing you to profile systems and literally purchase access through a remote access Trojan or RDP into some system that's been previously compromised, so that you don't even need to hack it anymore. You can literally use this as your own island hopping platform for $5,000 and up. I mean, you tell me, Keith, but frankly, this is what we're dealing with here. We need to come to Jesus on this. This has gotten so much worse. And the challenge is that most of these hackers are untouchable. They exist in a really a protection racket state where they're treated like Robin Hoods. And so long as they hack in a patriotic fashion, they're allowed to maintain their untouchable status. And that was illustrated in the Washington Post article that dropped yesterday.
This access mining, I was reading up on it. I mean, I was very familiar with it, but I really want to get involved. And Carbon Black actually put out a really good paper on it, and talking about crypto mining and how that's a really good avenue to get in and really drop this malware. And when you're looking at crypto mining, you're looking at using resources and then the dropping malware by using the access mining actually grabbing these credentials. It's just another area that people are exploring. Like you said, on the dark web and on these forums, you could buy anything you want. I mean, not even cyber, we'll talk just in general, anything nefarious you want to buy, you can go ahead and buy. So as you see on the screen here, this is a store called Genesis. And what they do here is they sell, when they call them fingerprinted, but it's basically a snapshot in time of your computer that you're able to access. And on the bottom part, you'll see different accounts they have access to. So they'll go and test these accounts, make sure they work, and then they'll sell these. They'll sell these for a short time, or they'll lease them out, I should say. So you can use these for 24 hours. You can get on and you can use all of these different accounts. And this is what you do for 24 hours. Just go ahead and exploit them. They buy these for pennies. I mean, they're $5, $10, $12. I mean, granted, you're not probably making hundreds of thousands of dollars, but if you have a couple hundred of these, it's unbelievable the access you can have.
This is not your mother's botnet, that's for sure. And
yeah.
what's scarier is that they're actually profiling all sorts of industries and then selling access to the highest bidder. You can think about non-state actors. You can think about ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who don't have the technical savoir-faire to hack systems, but what if they bought access to those systems? And then obviously they're granting access for free to the intelligence community within their sovereign boundaries as paying homage. And so then it's just insane. I'll shut up now.
It's funny, getting involved with the terrorist thing, that's a completely different area, I'll tell you. But yeah, the fact that these even exist, and this is kind of the lower level up to the higher level, like you said, it's pretty ingenious. It really is. So kind of moving on and summarizing, this is really the bread and butter, right? The investigations and the privilege and what do we do to move forward? Really trying to figure out what we're doing and seeing that normally, a cyber attack is seen as only an IT issue. We obviously in this conversation knows that's not the case. So I know, Will, you had said previously, and I'm going to go back to you again. There are regulatory control questions that are being addressed. There's data that's been identified that would trigger notification. What are these obligations? And I know we touched on them, but just really looking at the financial sector, it's really imperative to move forward understanding your cyber maturity and your cyber risk and what you're willing to deal with. Can you kind of summarize, what we're looking at here for regulatory and any type of questions we're talking about notification?
Sure. Well, financial institutions are one of the few industries that are federally regulated for privacy and data security under the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. And each financial institution sector has a different primary regulator that is responsible for ensuring that the financial institution is compliant with Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act and the regulations promulgated by that regulator. And generally, they come into, when we're talking about the obligation to safeguard data, the regulations thus far have not been very prescriptive in detailing the specific types of requirements that organizations must have. But what's really important is to learn through the guidance. For example, the SEC issues OCIE risk guidance on what they are seeing organizations do right and do wrong. And that gives you insight into what the enforcement arm of the SEC will be looking at when an organization has an incident. Did you have multi-factor authentication in place for your remote access? When we've said all along, our examination group has said all along that that's an area that needs to be addressed. Third-party vendor risk management needs to be addressed. So it's you've got the federal component of it, but you've also got the state breach notification laws that come into play that require you to, even though there are some exceptions in those laws that apply for organizations that are regulated by Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, most of them do not have that exception, and organizations still need to understand that they are required to notify state attorney generals and other regulatory agencies in certain states when an incident does result in unauthorized access to or acquisition of personal information. And that personal information includes account numbers. And even with that information, does not include account numbers, it may be, if there's sufficient information that may have been accessed that would allow the actors to conduct fraud on the account, whether that be because they now have information that would allow the actors to pass the identification questions that a financial institution asks an individual when they ask to reset their password, that would allow them to get access to the account. That type of information is the type of information that does trigger notice obligations. And so it's not just limited to bank account numbers, financial account numbers. It's really a broader set that organizations need to be concerned about, and they need to be concerned about the timing of those notifications as well, because regulators, particularly on the federal side, are expecting very prompt notification of an incident that may involve non-public personal information of customers, even though they don't have an express time requirement like some states do. There's Florida, and that has a 30-day notification requirement from the date of discovery. Most states are passing new laws that will shorten that amount of time because they're concerned. Obviously, the amount of delays between the time you discover an incident and the time that you notify the affected individuals, the more opportunity there is for identity theft and other misuse of that data. So that's kind of an overview of what that process of the regulatory landscape looks like. But one thing that I think is talk about and is when you structure these investigations at the outset, because you're going to be very likely subject to regulatory inquiries, it's really important to structure your forensic investigation with a Kroll through outside counsel to be able to assert privilege over the communications and work product that the financial institution has with that forensics firm, because one of the first things that the financial regulator is going to ask for is the forensic report that was prepared. And a lot of times, as you know, the forensic report by necessity details some of the weaknesses that the actors leverage to bypass some of the security. And so that's exactly what regulators are going to be looking for. So it's really important to structure it in a way that's going to give you an argument that you don't necessarily have to produce that report if you don't want to.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I know a lot of firms are doing that. Like you said, they're exploiting something that their weaknesses. That's a really good point. We had talked earlier this week about a bunch of different things, and one of the things that I thought was really interesting, kind of that wraps up everything here, is talking about someone who's really selling security products. Should they also be selling the services? Tom, what are your thoughts on that, and how do you think that I guess we should move forward in thinking about that, and how firms should approach that type of reaction?
Well, we at VMware Carbon Black think that's a conflict of interest. How can we possibly sell you a bulletproof vest and then sell you a gravedigger on the backside when it fails? I find that it's a reason why the major consulting firms back in the day were broken up because of Enron. I really don't believe that it is ethical, let alone it doesn't provide you a true ground truth or situational awareness when you are actually the one conducting the investigation because of the failure of your security controls. Much in the same way that we partner with you, Keith, we appreciate that you give us greater ground truth and greater expertise and objectivity in how you use our capability sets.
Yeah, it's funny. And a lot of I can't give an exact amount of percentage, but utilizing Carbon Black and endpoint detection, like you said, separating that is so beneficial, and it helps in every investigation. And any endpoint monitoring tool does help investigations move forward. And you're right. I agree with you. I think kind of separate is a better approach for all of us for sure. We talked about a lot of different things here today, and I really want to get, I don't know if there's more questions, but I want to get kind of final thoughts in what we want to do to move forward and provide everyone here that's listening to us to say, okay, this is the good key takeaway I got from this. Tom, I'm going to start with you. You have a wealth of experience in everything we're talking about. And in preparation for these individuals listening to us today, what is your recommendations about moving forward and being more proactive in someone's response?
Thank you, and thank you for even the ability to speak here today. Look, safety and soundness and trust and confidence will be dependent upon the fact that you can suppress intrusions in real time, decrease dwell time. You as general counsel shouldn't be intimidated by the techies vis-a-vis the technical babble and what the priorities should be. That being said, there's a few things you need to do and motivate your CIO and CISO to do. Number one, you got to integrate your security controls. They cannot be disparate. They must be integrated. That way you get a single pane of glass and greater visibility. You need to stand up or hire a cyber threat hunting team to come in and conduct regular cyber threat hunting. That is not incident response. That is proactively looking for behavioral anomalies or footprints on your systems that may exist before the alarms go off. Basically, metaphorically, before you close the bank for the day, you're checking to assure that no one's in the vault. You also need to employ new technologies like next-gen AV and EDR on systems, so you have that visibility that Keith will require when he comes in to conduct that investigation. And I firmly believe in something called just-in-time administration. No one should have administrative rights at all times. It should be limited to a specific task and role, including the C-level. And then last but not least, application control. Our dependency on applications, the dramatic increase of attacks on applications necessitate that we harden applications so that they only do explicitly what they're supposed to do. There's no deviation from that, because that's how hackers, ride your coattails inside the bank.
That's very. I'll tell you, it's funny. It took us to the very end to talk about administrative privileges, which is probably one of the greatest things that anyone. Well, I guess not want to say mistakes, but some of the things we see the most that are these administrative privileges are given out to those that shouldn't have it. It's so important, really important. Will, what are your kind of final thoughts? I know you see, you're on both sides. You see so much and really get involved with investigations and forensics as well as regulatory and any other concerns. I'm sure everyone here is really kind of on the edge of their seat, really wanting to hear what you have to say about best steps moving forward and what they can do to prevent something like this.
Yeah, I'd start with organizations, and if general counsel's on the line, really need to understand that cybersecurity, data protection is an enterprise-wide risk, and the organization at every level needs to have a role in understanding and mitigating those risks. And it's not a one-stop and you're done type of a process in determining what your risks are and implementing mitigating controls. It's something that requires ongoing diligence to keep up with your evolving environment as well as the evolving threat landscape. And so part of the enterprise approach is, number one, conducting risk assessments on a periodic basis to understand your risk profile, to do data mapping and data inventory to understand where your critical assets lie. Because in these type of network intrusions, one of the first questions that Keith is going to ask is, where are the crown jewels in the environment that we really need to focus on to be able to determine whether there's been unauthorized access or acquisition. And far too often we see organizations really not understand well where all of that sensitive data resides. So understanding your environment is very critical, and then preparing the final piece, and that means having a well-developed incident response team that's multidisciplinary, that has members from obviously your IT and security team, your engineering team, but also your general counsel's office, your communications department, and your operational department, because of the business continuity implications that a lot of these incidents present. And then having tabletop exercises where you actually put that to test. And there's a lot of learning that can go into running a mock exercise and questions that frequently arise in an incident that you don't want to be in the middle of a very stressful situation, having to make these tough decisions. And then finally, as part of that incident response preparation, identify those vendors that you're going to need to lean on to get assistance. Bring them in early and get them involved in your incident response planning and your risk assessments, because the more they know about your organization, the quicker they're going to respond, and they can tell you things of what you can do now to not only reduce your risk profile based upon what they're seeing in the threat landscape, but also will help them when an investigation is necessary, to tell you what sort of logging you need to be doing, what sort of endpoint detection tools you have in place, where your logs are aggregated. All of those things that you can work on now will really help the organization better respond when an incident does happen.
It's interesting you say. I'm going to kind of go back to someone says about collaboration, the question about collaboration. And Tom, working with you guys in Carbon Black, just the other day I had a client. We have Carbon Black, we have endpoint monitoring throughout for the year subscription, and they protect the network so well. we had a new person come in and say, hey, I was just attacked by XYZ ransomware, and they're asking for this huge amount of money. We looked into it, and we did the investigation. We found out what it was, what the attack vector was, and looking at other areas that we protect with Carbon Black, that incident was stopped. The same type of incident, same type of attack vector was stopped because Carbon Black was in place. So it's just so interesting, these partnerships, and you're talking about partnerships, instant response plans, knowing everyone together, knowing your system. All of this really combines to a really good defense when you're going to approach some of these actors. So, like you said, it's just so interesting that, partnerships are key to success in that kind of developing this cyber maturity. Leo, do we have any questions at all? We have about 5 minutes left.
Yeah, we have one short but punchy question from Gina. She's asking, given all that we talked about and the decrease in security budgets caused by COVID, how and where would you suggest focusing security investment?
So, first of all, I really want to address this. Number one, it's a all hands on deck approach right now. IT has a role to play in security. You need to enable sysadmins to become your new warriors on the front lines, and you need to do that by intrinsically deploying security across your infrastructure. Number two, cyber threat hunting exercises provide non-theoretical justification that you have a serious problem that must be dealt with immediately, or there'll be criminal negligence on the part of the leadership team. So you can use that as ammunition for yourself. And then lastly, get marketing budget. I know it sounds crazy, but get some of that marketing budget. Marketing right now accounts for 25 to 30% of the budget of the firm, of the institution. And yet, what's going on there? What happens with deploying marketing budget for brand protection, right? Because the worst case scenario is not the bank being robbed, it's the bank's infrastructure attacking its customers and its shareholders. So I'm a firm advocate that some of the marketing budget should be employed for cybersecurity because the nature in which they've increased the attack surface and the exposures through the development of multiple campaigns that use outside sources. I'll leave that there.
Hopefully no one from marketing is on. No, but you're spot on. I tell you, the budgets. So we work with a couple partners, and that's what they do. They have our services, and they realize that value of what we're doing is not only protecting the IT, but it's protecting everybody as a whole. Just to shoot a number out there. So Ryuk was the most used ransomware variant in 2019. It kind of went off a little bit in 2020, but still ransomware is going out there. The average case of Ryuk ransomware, I should say the average ask for ransom for Ryuk is right around 600K. So kind of average that out, and where do you play? Where does your budget fall into place? It's so interesting because do you want to pay the $600,000? Do you have cyber insurance? Or how does that roll? You really need to, like you said, make a joint effort. This is a company-wide issue that you need to solve, and I think you're right. I mean, Leo, of course, would be against pulling out of marketing, but hey, you need to protect it because when it comes down to it, it's everybody in that organization that's going to be affected.
Yeah, and I just add a couple of points that, when it comes to deciding where you want to invest, if they are limited resources, which everybody has finite resources, it's making smart investments for your risk profile. And, I'd recommend oftentimes before you're sort of making these big purchases of new products and really rolling out your next year's budget, do a small risk assessment to understand where your greatest risks lie. And sometimes it's not expensive products that are going to mitigate some of those greatest risks. A lot of cybersecurity today is the blocking and tackling that organizations need to maintain good cybersecurity hygiene. I can't tell you how many critical vulnerabilities we've seen recently that have gone unpatched for way too long and have been exploited. And that's really just blocking and tackling of patch management. Same with access management. Legacy vendors having access to credentials when they never need that access anymore. A lot of it comes down to just pure blocking and tackling, and that comes into better processes and procedures at the organization. But risk assessments overall can be really helpful, particularly when you bring in outsiders like Kroll and legal to that, or seeing what's going on in the threat landscape in your specific industry and your peers, and can tell you practically how to rank each of those risks and where your best bang for the buck to mitigate those risks are, so you're using your budget more wisely.
Yeah, you're right. Doing that phased approach, like, hey, this is paramount. And, do that risk assessment, and then you phase it out over a period of time. And I think that's 100% accurate. So we're just about out of time. Will, Tom, I want to thank you so much for being on this. This is a lot of fun. I really enjoyed speaking with you guys and really having this discussion. It was really nice of you guys to take the time and sharing your expertise with everyone here. I'd also like to thank everyone that joined. On behalf of all of us, thank you for joining, and really hope you guys have a wonderful week. And have any questions, feel free to contact us. Our numbers are below. We'll be more than happy to answer additional questions if you need it. And Leo, of course, thank you very much for coordinating this and making this happen. Guys, have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.